Imagine you're settling in to read a classic 19th century novel.
Oh, yeah, like a nice thick one.
Right, exactly. Or maybe you're sitting in a velvet chair listening to this grand sweeping opera.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah, you'd think you're just consuming art, right? Just taking in a story.
Yeah.
But what if hidden inside the margins of those pages or buried in the sheet music, you are actually consuming the hidden blueprints of global empire?
Wow. I mean, that is a staggering thought.
It really is.
Just the idea that these aesthetic objects we revere, the ones we consider to be transcendent or completely free from worldly politics,
right,
that they're actually doing the heavy lifting of normalizing domination.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to the mission of today's deep dive.
Okay.
We are looking at Edward Said's monumental book from 1993 called Culture and Imperialism.
Such an important text.
It really is. And our goal today is to examine how Western culture and global imperialism were just fundamentally intertwined. We're going to explore how art prepared the ground for empire and, equally importantly, how colonized people eventually used culture to fight back.
It is a massive sweeping topic, honestly. Said is looking at how the very shape of the modern world was forged, not just by, canons and treaties, but by narratives and storytelling.
Before we really get into the thick of it, though, I do need to make something very clear to our listener.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The source materials we are drawing on for this deep dive contain highly politically charged viewpoints.
Very much so.
We are going to be exploring Marxist critiques, conservative pushback, feminist analysis, and post-colonial theory.
It covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, and so it's incredibly important to state that we as your hosts are not taking sides here.
Right.
We are impartially reporting on these texts just to convey the ideas of the original authors.
Exactly.
We're not endorsing any specific political stance. Our job is simply to unpack the arguments as they were presented in the literature.
Yeah, we are examining the debate, not participating in it.
Well said.
And it is a fierce, fascinating debate that forces you to question how you read, how you listen, and really how you understand history.
Yeah, I was really struck by just the sheer ambition of this book.
Oh, the huge.
To understand culture and imperialism, you really have to look at it as a macro sequel to Said's landmark 1978 book, Orientalism.
Right, which was a massive deal in its own right.
Totally. In that earlier work, he essentially changed the whole landscape of cultural studies by arguing that the West's study of the Middle East was deeply intertwined with imperialist ideologies.
Yeah, creating this stereotype of the Orient to justify colonial rule.
Exactly. But I know that book focused mainly on the Middle East, so I assume this 1993 sequel is his attempt to cast a much wider net.
He dramatically expands the canvas here. I mean, he moves way beyond the Middle East.
Okay.
He starts looking at the British, French, and eventually American empires on a global scale.
Wow.
We were talking about India,
Yep.
Africa, the Caribbean, Australia. He's looking for a general worldwide pattern of imperial culture.
And his own background clearly plays a huge role in how he views this global pattern, right?
Well, absolutely. You can't separate his work from his life.
The sources talk a lot about his exilic perspective.
Right.
Because he was a Palestinian Arab, but he grew up with a Western education, and then he spent his professional life living and teaching in New York City.
Yeah, at Columbia University.
Right.
Yeah.
So he describes himself as belonging to both the Arab and Western worlds, but simultaneously being entirely at home in neither.
That exilic perspective is foundational to his entire worldview.
I kept thinking of an analogy while I was reading about this.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's like being the only bilingual person in a room full of two different groups who are just aggressively arguing with each other.
Oh, like that.
Like, you understand the nuances and the anger and the history of both sides perfectly, but because you sit in the middle, you don't belong completely to either group.
Right.
You are an insider and an outsider everywhere you go.
Yeah.
So how does that unique vantage point change the way we actually read history?
Well, that dual awareness is crucial. I mean, if you belong to only one culture, it's very easy to adopt this triumphant linear view of history.
Like, our civilization did this, we built that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Said's exilic position means he is always aware of the other. He sees the towering achievements of Western culture, which he genuinely admires, by the way. I mean, he's a professor of literature, after all.
Right. He loved these books.
He really did. But he also feels the historical trauma of the people who were subjugated to build that culture. He refuses to separate the two things.
Which brings us to how he actually defines culture in the first place.
Right.
We throw that word around a lot, but Seed has a very specific two-pronged definition in this book.
He does.
First, he says culture represents the autonomous practices of representation and communication.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning things like the novel poetry, ethnographic descriptions.
Basically the actual art.
Yeah, these aesthetic forms whose principal aim often seems to be just pleasure or specialized knowledge. They appear to exist totally separately from the messy realms of economics and politics.
But his second definition is where the friction happens.
Yeah.
He asserts that culture is also a refining and elevating element of society. You know, the best that has been known and thought, to borrow a phrase.
Okay.
But over time, this concept of culture becomes fiercely tied to national identity.
Oh, I see.
It becomes this combative source of us versus them.
So it's not just art anymore.
Exactly. It's the theater where political and ideological causes engage each other. It's the mechanism that ultimately says we are civilized and they are not, therefore we have the right to rule them.
Wow. So culture isn't just this museum of pretty things.
No.
It's an active battlefield where identities are forged and justified.
Spot on. And Serried argues that most professional scholars have historically treated culture as a protective enclosure.
Like they just check their politics at the door.
Yeah, they want to read Charles Dickens or Jane Austen in a complete vacuum of aesthetic brilliance.
Right, totally quarantined from the sordid cruelty of slavery or colonial oppression that was happening at the exact same time.
Exactly. Even though often that oppression was actually funding the very societies those authors lived in.
So to understand how this battlefield operates, we have to look at how the past kind of bleeds into the present.
Right.
The sources give a statistic that is frankly mind-blowing.
Let's hear it.
By 1914, Europe held roughly 85% of the Earth as colonies protectorates independence.
85%.
85%. It is an almost unimaginable concentration of power.
It really is.
And Said insists that you cannot have an empire that vast without it entirely shaping the mindset of the home country.
Oh, absolutely. It permeates everything.
I was actually surprised to see him bring the poet T.S. Eliot into this to explain that mindset.
Oh, yeah. Eliot is an interesting choice there.
But thinking about it, Eliot's whole thing was about how the past actively lives in the present.
Right.
That makes perfect sense when you look at how colonial history didn't just evaporate the second a country claimed independence.
Yeah. Stitt draws heavily on that concept to explain that the legacy of that 85% global domination is still deeply active today.
Right.
He uses the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War as a prime example of opposed historical narratives clashing.
Oh, so?
Well, during that war, you had two fundamentally opposed histories colliding.
Okay.
The Iraqi Ba'ath Party framed their actions through a history of unfulfilled Arab independence.
Ah, so a promise they felt was betrayed by Western imperialism.
Exactly. So they were justifying their actions as righting a historical wrong.
And the other side.
On the other side, the United States framed its history not as an imperial power, but as a benevolent force defending freedom.
Wow, so both sides were using highly edited versions of the past to justify massive violence in the present.
Precisely.
So to cut through those conflicting, highly edited narratives, Said introduces a reading technique. He calls it contrapuntal reading.
Yes. This is such a crucial concept.
The sources say it's derived from Western classical counterpoint in music, where you hear multiple melodies at once.
Right. They're harmonically interdependent, yet independent in rhythm and contour.
So for Said, reading contrapuntally means reading a text with a simultaneous awareness of two things.
Okay.
First, the metropolitan history being narrated by the author, and second, the hidden, suppressed history of the colonized people against which the dominating discourse acts.
So you're listening to the dominant melody of the European author while simultaneously listening for the marginalized harmony of the colonized subjects.
But let me push back on that musical analogy for a second.
Okay, go for it.
If contrapuntal reading is like hearing the melody and the harmony at the same time, what happens when the harmony is intentionally muted by the composer?
Ah, that's the tricky part.
Right, because how do you reliably read a silence? If the author deliberately leaves the colonized voices out completely, doesn't that risk the reader just projecting their own modern politics onto a blank space where an author simply didn't write anything?
That is a very valid challenge. It's a common critique of this method, actually.
I would imagine so.
But Seed would argue that you aren't just projecting modern politics. You're looking at what the text structurally requires to function.
What do you mean by structurally requires?
You look at what the text assumes and takes for granted. The silence of the native isn't just an omission. It is a load-bearing pillar for the imperial narrative.
Oh, I see.
You have to actively reconstruct the muted harmony by looking at the geographical spaces the novel relies on, or the labor it casually mentions.
To see this in action, the book points to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
The classic example.
Conrad's novella is about Marlowe's journey into the Congo to find Kurtz, an ivory trader who has essentially set himself up as this brutal demigod.
Right. We know this story as the basis for the movie Apocalypse Now.
Exactly. Now, Conrad is fascinating because he is ruthlessly honest about the horrors of imperialism.
He really is.
He exposes the greed, the violence, the absolute moral corruption of the European presence in Africa. He doesn't dress it up as a noble civilizing mission at all.
He sees right through that.
Yeah.
But, and here's the catch, while Conrad can see the corruption of the colonizers, he is completely trapped in the imperial worldview when it comes to the colonized.
Trap how?
He simply cannot imagine a history or a future where the African natives are independent, sovereign people with their own agency.
Oh, wow.
For Conrad, the choices are either brutal European domination or absolute savage darkness. There's no alternative in his mind.
So even as he critiques the empire, he's confirming its underlying logic.
Exactly.
The logic that the West is the only source of historical momentum. The Africans in the book are just kind of background scenery for the white man's moral crisis.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
Sid is showing us the outer limits of the imperial imagination here.
Right.
Even the most critical, self-aware European writers of the time could not conceive of a world outside the imperial framework.
So if Conrad showed us the horrific, violent edge of empire in the Congo, how did everyday Londoners stomach it?
Well, they needed a softer narrative to make it feel normal.
Which brings us right to the cozy parlors of the 19th century European novel.
It does indeed.
Stead makes a massive claim here. He says, without empire, the European novel as we know it does not exist.
It's a bold statement, but let's look at the evidence he provides, starting with Charles Dickens and Great Expectations.
Okay, let's break that down. It's a classic coming-of-age story about a young boy named Pip, right?
Right. Pip believes he's being funded by the eccentric Miss Havisham,
Yeah.
but he eventually discovers his true benefactor is Abel Magwitch.
The terrifying convict Pip helped when he was a kid.
Exactly. Magwitch was transported to the penal colony of Australia where he made a fortune, and he secretly sends that money back to make Pip a gentleman.
Okay, but how does a subplot about Australia prove the entire form of the novel relies on empire?
Well, Sed asks us to look contrapuntally at why Australia is there in the story.
Okay.
Australia functions as a spatial off-ramp for Britain's unwanted population.
Oh, I see.
Magwitch can expiate his crimes and make money there, but he is strictly forbidden from returning to the civilized metropolitan space of London.
Right, because he's tainted.
Exactly. When he does return, he is hunted down and dies. And crucially, after Pip loses Magwitch's fortune, how does he eventually find redemption and financial stability?
I think he goes to work as a trader in the East.
Yes.
Yeah.
He goes east.
Wow, so the colonies are casually utilized as a mechanism to resolve the plot.
Yes, and to balance the economic ledgers of the characters in England.
That's wild. The entire moral and financial trajectory of the novel depends on the existence of these distant, subordinate territories.
Territories that exist solely to service the metropolis.
It's just the background radiation of the story.
It really is.
And it's even more subtle in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park.
Well, Mansfield Park is such a brilliant example of this.
Yeah, the beautiful, orderly, moral estate of the Bertram family in England is entirely sustained by the profits of a sugar plantation they own in Antigua.
A sugar plantation, which inherently means a slave plantation.
Exactly.
And when there are financial problems on the plantation, the patriarch, Sir Thomas Bertram, has to travel to Antigua to, quote, restore order.
Right.
While he's gone, the moral order of the English estate just falls apart.
Everyone starts acting terribly.
Exactly. And then when he returns, order is restored. Sed points out how casually Austen links the orderly running of the English estate with the orderly unseen running of the slave plantation.
The novel doesn't endorse slavery. In fact, I don't think it's barely mentioned, but it just accepts the imperial arrangement as a normal, necessary fact of life.
Yes, it's just the water they're swimming in.
So is Sed trying to, cancel Jane Austen or Charles Dickens with this analysis? I mean, are we supposed to stop reading them?
Not at all, and he is very explicit about this.
Okay, good.
Sed loves these novels. He's not assigning blame or trying to throw them out of the canon.
Then what does he say?
He's saying that if you ignore the imperial context, you were misreading the books. By understanding how these masterpieces normalize the power dynamics of empire, you actually enrich your understanding of the texts.
I see.
You see them as worldly objects deeply embedded in their historical reality, not just floating in an aesthetic vacuum.
All right, we have to read the fine print.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just happening in British novels either. The sources mention Rudyard Kipling's Kim, which is set in India.
Oh yeah, Kim is a fascinating case.
Because Kipling genuinely loved India, right? He portrayed it with incredible detail and affection.
He did. But Said points out what Kipling omits.
Okay.
Kim was published in 1901, but the novel completely erases the 1857 mutiny.
The massive, bloody Indian rebellion against British rule.
Yes. By writing that history out, Kipling creates an Orientalized India.
Ah.
A place that is colorful and vibrant, but ultimately static, happily existing under eternal British tutelage.
It's a fantasy of unresisting colonialism.
Exactly. It's a very specific, curated version of India.
And the French utilized this literary erasure too. Albert Camus, the great existentialist, wrote his famous novel L'Étranger, or The Stranger.
Set in French colonized Algeria.
Right. And the protagonist, Meursault, shoots an Arab on the beach. But Camus casually strips the Algerian Arabs of their names and their history.
They are just nameless, silent figures in the background of a Frenchman's existential crisis.
Which perfectly reflects the deep French colonial appropriation of Algerian geography and identity.
It's a total erasure of the native population's humanity.
So we talked a lot about novels, but the empire used high art to specifically grand opera.
Oh, this is one of my favorite parts of the book.
The example of Verdi's Aida blew my mind. I always thought of Aida as this pure celebration of Egyptian antiquity.
Most people do.
But the context of its creation tells a completely different story.
It really does. Aida is a brilliant example of how imperialism functioned through prestige and culture.
How so?
Well, it was commissioned by the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, to celebrate the opening of the Khedivial Opera House in Cairo in 1871.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a local ruler commissioning local art, right?
It does. But the Khedive was heavily reliant on European finance.
Oh.
Debt that would eventually lead to British occupation, actually.
Oh.
And the story of Aida and its authentic Egyptian setting was actually constructed by Auguste Mariette, a French Egyptologist. It was a European fantasy of ancient Egypt, packaged and sold back to a Middle Eastern ruler.
And performed by Europeans for a tiny, elite, mostly European audience in Cairo.
Exactly. The sources mention an aesthetic of separation here.
What does that mean?
The opera house and the performance mirrored the physical segregation of Cairo at the time. You had a European city built alongside, but entirely separate from the native Arab city.
Oh, wow.
So Aida was this glittering cultural artifact that confirmed Europe's power to study, classify, and represent the Orient, even while performing it on Oriental soil.
That is just incredible. But it's a mistake to think the people living under this massive cultural machine were just passively absorbing it, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point.
They were reading the novels, they were watching the operas, and eventually they started using the same cultural weapons to strike back.
Yes.
Because if the empire justified itself by saying, you have no history, you have no civilization, we are bringing it to you, then writing your own history is a profound act of rebellion.
It's the ultimate counter-narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Said identifies a specific movement he calls the voyage in.
The voyage in, what does that refer to?
This refers to intellectuals from the colonies who received Western educations, traveled to the metropolitan centers like London and Paris, and used the imperial languages and academic methods to dismantle the empire from within.
Ah, he focuses heavily on people like C.L.R. James, a West Indian historian who wrote The Black Jacobins.
Right, a groundbreaking history of the Haitian Revolution.
And George Antonius, who wrote The Arab Awakening. These scholars prove that colonized people had agency, sophisticated political movements, and historical momentum.
Yes, they were writing themselves back into the center of the story.
The sources also mention a novelist who did this brilliantly, Tayeb Salih, and his book Season of Migration to the North.
Such a powerful book. This is a perfect literary example of the voyage in.
How so?
Salih was Sudanese, and his novel essentially reverses the trajectory of Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Oh, really?
Yeah, instead of a white European traveling down the river into the dark heart of Africa, Salih writes about a Sudanese man traveling north into the heart of Europe. London, where he unleashes psychological and physical violence on European society.
Wow.
It is a direct conscious disruption of the European narrative, writing back to the center from the periphery.
So they are fighting back culturally. But Said doesn't just romanticize this resistance, right? He brings in the theories of Frantz Fanon.
Yes, Fanon is vital here. He was a Martinican psychiatrist and philosopher heavily involved in the Algerian Revolution.
Right, and Fanon makes a really sharp distinction between nationalism and true liberation.
He does. Fanon warned that simply achieving national independence, kicking out the white colonizers and raising a new flag, was not enough.
Why wasn't it enough?
Because if you only achieve nationalism, you often just replace foreign oppressors with local dictators who replicate the exact same structures of exploitation.
Right, the nationalist bourgeoisie, as Fanon called them, they just step into the shoes of the departed masters. It makes me think of a hostile corporate takeover.
Oh, how so?
Like the new management comes in, they rebrand the company, change the logo on the building, but they keep the exact same toxic org chart, just with different names on the executive doors.
That is a perfect analogy. So workers at the bottom are still getting crushed by the same mechanisms.
Exactly. That structural continuity is what Fanon feared most.
Yeah.
True liberation for Fanon and Said requires a shift from national consciousness to social consciousness. It requires dismantling the oppressive structures entirely.
And Said points to V.S. Naipaul's novel A Bend in the River to illustrate the failure of mere nationalism, right? He does. In that book, an unnamed African country is ruled by a tyrant known only as the big man,
who manipulates and murders his own people just as ruthlessly as the colonizers did.
Exactly. It's a stark warning.
That failure of the old colonial model didn't end imperialism, though.
No, it just evolved.
The flags changed, but the power dynamic simply mutated as the United States took the mantle after the Cold War.
Right. The British and the French empires pack up their administrative buildings, but the baton of empire gets passed.
Said writing in the early 90s, just after the end of the Cold War, observes that the American empire looks different from the 19th century British or French models.
Very different. It's less about planting flags and more about economic hegemony, military interventions, and crucially, media control.
I really want to dig into that mechanism of media control. How does modern cultural imperialism actually manufacture consent?
Said focuses specifically on how mass media and information control shape public perception to support interventionist foreign policies.
Okay.
Going back again to the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, he argues that the media presented a highly sanitized, controlled narrative that manufactured consent for the war while completely obscuring the historical and political complexities of the Arab world.
You know, when I think back to the footage of the Gulf War, it looked so different from, say, the raw, visceral journalism of the Vietnam War.
Completely different.
The Gulf War broadcasts on CNN were all crosshairs, green night vision, and sterile language about surgical strikes.
Right.
It effectively turned war into a video game divorcing the Western viewer from the human reality on the ground.
That video game aesthetic is the exact mechanism of control. It removes the human cost and replaces it with technological superiority.
That's chilly.
Furthermore, Said critiques the reduction of complex regions into buzzwords like terrorism and fundamentalism.
Right, just throwing those words around.
Yeah, these terms become thought-terminating cliches. They lack precise definition, but they instantly confer moral authority on the West and criminalize the non-Western subjects.
It's a continuation of the old imperial habit of essentializing the native.
Exactly.
Reducing millions of diverse people with complex histories into a single threatening caricature that requires Western intervention to manage.
It's the same old playbook, just on a new screen.
So as a countermeasure to this kind of monolithic imperial thinking, Said points to the figure of the migrant and the exile.
Yes.
He argues that in a world deeply scarred by imperialism, true liberation is tied to those who cross borders, who inhabit multiple cultures, and who refuse to be reduced to a single pure identity.
He writes, no one today is purely one thing.
I love that quote.
It's beautiful. The exile, because they live between worlds, is uniquely positioned to resist the dogmatism and chauvinism that fuel both imperialism and reactionary nationalism.
It brings us right back to his own exilic perspective that we talked about at the beginning.
It all comes full circle.
Now, building a theory this massive is like painting a giant target on your back.
Oh, definitely.
And the scholarly world definitely took aim. Culture and imperialism sparked some incredibly fierce debates.
It did indeed.
It had its fervent admirers, of course. The scholar Paul Beauvais praised it as a masterpiece of Gothian humanism.
Which is high praise indeed.
Egothian humanism. For those of us who aren't literature professors, what does that actually mean in this context?
Well, it refers to the German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's concept of Weltliteratur, or world literature.
Okay.
Bove is praising Said for looking at human culture as a deeply interconnected global whole, rather than isolated national traditions.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, he celebrates Said's vast erudition and his ultimate message of hope and reconciliation across cultural divides.
But the critiques came from multiple scholarly camps, and they pulled no punches.
No, they did not.
Let's dive into the Marxist critique, specifically focusing on a reviewer named John Rusa.
Rusa is a heavy hitter here.
Rusa's critique is fundamental. He argues that Said completely missed or actively ignored the root cause of 19th century imperialism, which is capitalism.
Right. Said defines imperialism mostly in terms of territorial control and cultural attitudes.
Yeah.
But Rusa argues that you cannot decouple European imperialism from the massive economic drivers of global capitalism.
You mean like the insatiable need for raw materials, new markets, cheap labor, all that stuff?
Exactly. By treating imperialism as mostly a cultural mindset, Said ignores the ledger books that actually launched the ships.
But Rusa also attacks Said's methodological focus on the novel, right?
He does.
Said claims the novel was the main driver of imperial consent. But Rusa points out a rather glaring historical fact. The vast majority of 19th century Europeans were illiterate.
And that is a significant hurdle for Said's theory.
I mean, that completely blows a hole in Said's premise, doesn't it?
It's definitely a problem.
If the working class in London can't even read Great Expectations, how on earth is Charles Dickens manufacturing their consent for the empire?
Well, Said's defenders would point to Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony.
Which is what?
The idea is that elite culture trickles down, even if a dock worker isn't reading Jane Austen. The worldview constructed in high literature filters down into popular theater, penny dreadfuls, music hall songs, and political rhetoric.
Oh, so it just kind of seeps into the culture at large.
Right. The novel establishes the baseline reality for the ruling class, who then disseminate that worldview downward.
I see.
But Rusa's point stands. Said didn't do the work of showing that trickle-down effect. He just focused on elite texts.
Rusa also warns about the political implications of Said's conclusion.
Yes.
Because Said focuses on liberating people from nationalism and cultural essentialism rather than liberating them from capitalism. Rusa suggests that Said's work could easily be co-opted by multinational corporations.
It's a very sharp critique.
After all, global capitalism also loves a borderless world free from national restrictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A borderless world is great for the exile, but it's also great for a multinational conglomerate looking for cheap labor.
Right. Then there is the feminist critique. The sources mention Harriet D. Lyons, who points out a staggering blind spot in the book: the glaring absence of women.
It's a very noticeable omission.
She notes that while Said is incredibly detailed about male writers and male resistance movements, his discussion of women is perfunctory at best.
Yeah.
For example, he completely ignores the Igbo Women's War of 1929 in Nigeria.
And the omission of that specific event is very telling.
What exactly was the Igbo Women's War?
Also known as the Aba Women's Riots, it was a massive anti-colonial rebellion led entirely by women.
Wow.
Thousands of women organized across ethnic lines to protest British taxation and the imposition of corrupt warrant chiefs.
And they were successful.
They exerted immense political pressure. They used traditional practices like, quote, sitting on a man, which involved public shaming, singing, and basically following the chiefs everywhere.
That's amazing.
It eventually forced the colonial administration to back down on a lot of issues.
So by omitting this, Said fundamentally changes his own thesis.
He really does.
He misses a profoundly non-Western female-led cultural resistance. He just erases female agency in dismantling the empire.
Yes. And furthermore, Lyons is disappointed that when Say does mention great female writers of resistance like Nadine Gordimer or Toni Morrison, they're just lumped into summary lists.
Like an afterthought.
Exactly. Rather than given the deep contrapuntal analysis he affords to men like Conrad or Camus.
Right.
And major figures like Doris Lessing and Alice Walker are missing entirely. She argues he failed to engage with the rich tradition of feminist critiques of imperialism, which had been analyzing the intersection of race, gender, and colonial power for decades.
Yeah, that's a major gap. There is also a post-colonial critique from Marie-Paul Ha regarding Said's celebration of the exile and hybridity.
Right. This is a really grounding critique.
Ha argues that Said's romanticization of being in exile, living between cultures, is a luxury for the privileged.
It is.
It's exhilarating if you are a highly educated intellectual living in New York or Paris. But if you are an economically disenfranchised refugee or migrant being caught between cultures, isn't liberating.
No, it's terrifyingly disorienting and dangerous.
Right. It's the difference between being a cosmopolitan professor jet-setting between conferences and being a stateless refugee fleeing conflict.
Exactly. It grounds high theory in harsh material reality.
Finally, there's the conservative critique. Neil McGinnis calls the book intellectual sprawl.
Ouch.
Yeah, McGinnis questions the fundamental premise, arguing that said slides from literary criticism into political polemic.
He questions the actual evidence that a novel like Jane Eyre is fundamentally about empire just because there is a character from the West Indies.
Right. He accuses said of extravagant generalizations and shifting definitions to suit his political arguments.
It is a remarkably diverse academic battlefield surrounding this text.
Let me try to synthesize these critiques.
Go for it.
It sounds like said built a beautiful, incredibly intricate telescope to look at culture and empire.
Okay, I like that.
But the Marxists are angry. He didn't point it at the economy. The feminists are angry. He only pointed it at men. The post-colonialists think the telescope is only available to the rich, and the conservatives think the telescope is fundamentally broken.
That is an excellent summary of the academic reception, honestly.
So despite these flaws, and they are significant structural flaws, how does this book hold up today?
Really well, actually.
As we move into our conclusion, what is the ultimate synthesis here?
The enduring legacy of culture and imperialism is its insistence that knowledge and culture are never neutral.
They're always doing something.
Yes. They're intimately tied to geography, to power, and to history.
Right.
Even if you accept all the critiques said permanently changed the way we read the Western canon, he proved that the history of the colonizer and the colonized are inextricably intertwined.
You literally cannot understand the bustling wealth of 19th century London without understanding the penal colonies of Australia or the sugar plantations of Antigua.
You really can't. The books just don't make sense without them.
And for our listener who feels overwhelmed by, say, 147 news cycles, how does Said's warning about the media help us become better consumers of information today? Why does this matter right now?
It matters because the dynamics of imperialism didn't vanish. They evolved.
Yeah.
Understanding how culture normalizes power helps us decode the media we consume every day. It helps us understand the politics of neo-imperialism, the ways certain nations justify interventions, and the ways marginalized groups are stereotyped.
It gives you a critical toolkit to look for the silenced voices in any narrative you encounter.
As you say.
That's about not accepting the surface level of the story. And that brings me to a final provocative thought.
All right.
Some for everyone to mull over after this deep dive ends. We spent all this time talking about how the 19th century European novel and grand opera were the cultural technologies that normalized the classic empires.
Right.
They made domination seem natural, even inevitable. So what is the cultural technology normalizing today's digital, borderless economic empires?
Wow. That is the crucial question of our era.
Is it the globalized streaming platforms that export a very specific, sanitized cultural viewpoint to every screen on Earth?
Very possibly.
Or perhaps it's the social media algorithms themselves, these invisible codes designed in Silicon Valley that dictate our reality, sort us into targetable demographics, and manufacture our consent without us even realizing we are participating in an imperial project.
That is a chilling but entirely necessary line of inquiry.
If Edward Said were writing today, I have a feeling he wouldn't just be reading Jane Austen. He'd be doing a contrapuntal reading of the algorithm.
I think you're absolutely right.
Something to think about the next time you scroll.
That's all for today's deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.